I heard about this book, Events of an Ordinary Life, from my book club. I was surprised that it wasn't a typical book. It was short stories. The stories in the book are amazing because the author manages to tell a tale with so few words, but he paints such a vivid picture of what's going on that you are there with him. And you get caught up in the character's life. And what gets me about these stories is that every time you think you've got the end figured out, it's totally different. Some of them remind me of like Stephen King's stories because they're so different than what you expect things to happen. The fun part about this book is that some of these stories are true and some are, of course, are fictional, but you never know for sure what you're getting into once you get started with the story. They kind of remind me of the short Reader Digest versions of books from years ago. But I would recommend it to people that say they don't care to read because the stories are short. You get an impact from each story like within minutes once you start reading the stories. This book, The Events of an Ordinary Life, is not anybody's ordinary life. This guy, because of his work as a private investigator, I'm sure he was into a lot of dicier circumstances than most. But it makes me want to take the ordinary events of my life and write some short stories about it. You know, an ordinary life could be interesting to somebody else that doesn't have the same life as you. And that's got me motivated.
My name is Lorraine, and I am here to tell you what I thought about Events of an Ordinary Life. Because of where some of these stories took place, I was able to relate because I'm originally from Hoboken. The attraction is really mostly the fact that they're short stories. I had some favorites, whether they were based on true events or they weren't. One of them was called The Neighbor, and I literally gasped when I finished reading that story. There was another, I think the name of the story was Matilda, and it was based on the technology in a car. But there were other stories that made me gasp, and others that made me cry. I think the draw to this book was the fact that you could read a story and stop right there and then come back to it without wondering, where did I leave off? Because in the beginning of the book, it says where he's from, and it says that he was a private detective for a while. So I'm sure that the people will think that the books that were based on true events are all the ones that have to do with the private investigator. I'm the type of person who maybe gets hooked on a trilogy where you have to read 3 books to get to the final ending. This was a breath of fresh air because you're not tied into this long drawn out novel. And so you can read a story that's 2 pages long, a half a page, 8 pages, and just stop whenever you want. You can read a novel in between the chapters. I found out about this book by a friend on Facebook. And I belong to a book club and recommended it to them. And we just talked about this book maybe last month. And it was interesting to see what everyone had to say about it. And no haters, but people who welcomed the fact that it was so different than all these long drawn out novels that we wind up reading, and that they loved the humor, they loved the surprise, the shock. I don't think the author of this book lived an ordinary life. I'm happy that he shared this with us.
is Jeanette Nelson, and I came here today to speak about a book. Well, it wasn't what I expected, which was very pleasing. I have to be honest with you, I hadn't read a book of short stories in, I want to say 50 or 60 years since I was in school. So it was delightful to read an anthology again. Well, one of the things that I noticed because of Frank's profession, he saw people in a different way. One of the things that I enjoyed reading about the book is that it was about the New York area, and it had to do with law. My great-grandfather and my grandfather were attorneys. I understood as I became older what prompted them to pursue that career. They led a very violent life in their youth, and they wanted to make an impression and change. And in some of the stories, you see the endings. Either sometimes you're happy with them, and sometimes you wished maybe it had changed a little. But mankind is not always susceptible to change like that. The fact that some of the stories were actually true was amazing to me. He pulled from some of the people that he came in contact with, and then some of them being fiction, and I thought, wow, that's where almost the romance of writing comes in. You have it in your head and you want to put it down onto paper and you want to share that with someone. I noticed not only the cover, but I loved the title of the book. And everybody has a lot of ordinary things that occur in their life, and they're not always able to put it down on paper. But this was a case where this gentleman, Frankie, did, and it was very pleasurable. And I think if you need to look at something and enjoy it and not go through 500 or 600 pages in order to do so, this is a very welcoming book.
I read this book about a month ago, and it took me, I would say, about 3 evenings to read the whole book. So this book was different from what I normally read because I normally read novels. I don't read short stories. But these short stories, they kept me wanting more. This book would be perfect for the person who would enjoy short stories because there's a little bit of everything in this book. They will enjoy some of it. They may not enjoy all of it, but it will be very interesting for them to read it. I'm looking forward to seeing what the author comes up next because I'm hoping it will be a longer format novel. Being from the Northeast, I recognized a lot of locations in the book, which really interests me because I could relate to a lot of it. So I was having fun with that. Without spoiling any stories for anybody, my favorite story out of the book was the Hurricane Sandy story with a woman in her condo and what she experienced during the storm. And the reason I love that is because I could relate because I was there during Sandy. My recommendation would be to pick up The Events of an Ordinary Life and enjoy it.